What if I told you that for every war you knew about, there were 3 more fought entirely in secret? From the Venetian spy networks of the 1500s to digital weapons like the Stuxnet that silently destroyed nuclear facilities, the most decisive conflicts in history often left no visible battlefields. These weren't minor skirmishes or footnotes in history. These shadow wars overthrew governments, redirected trillions in resources that shaped the borders and power structures we live with today. Yet most people have never heard of Operation Gladio, the CIA's Tibetan Uprising, or the secret wars in Laos that claimed more lives than many official conflicts. While Europe's royal courts engaged in open power struggles during the Renaissance, another battlefield existed in the shadows. In the 1500s, the Venetian Republic, a maritime powerhouse at the crossroads of East and West, operated what historians now recognize as one of history's first professional intelligence networks. Rising from the waters of the Adriatic, Venice wasn't just a city of merchants and artisans, but a formidable state whose survival depended on knowing its enemy's secrets before they knew Venice's. At the heart of this clandestine operation stood the Council of Ten, established initially as a temporary committee in 1310 following a failed coup attempt. By the 16th century, this secretive body had evolved into Venice's premier security apparatus. Meeting in chambers within the Doge's palace, council members governed with absolute authority over matters of state security, employing a ruthless efficiency that kept both external threats and internal dissidents at bay. What made Venice's spy network revolutionary was its systematic approach. Rather than relying on ad hoc intelligence gathering, the Republic maintained permanent agents across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. These operatives embedded themselves in foreign courts from Constantinople to London, meticulously documenting everything from military preparations to dynastic marriages that might shift the balance of power. Venice pioneered what modern intelligence agencies call human intelligence. The Republic's web of informants spanned all social classes, from ship captains who reported on foreign harbors to servants who overheard conversations between ambassadors. Perhaps most fascinating was Venice's strategic use of courtesans as intelligence assets. These educated women, often fluent in multiple languages and trained in arts and literature, extracted valuable information from visiting dignitaries and merchants who frequented their salons and bedchambers. The Venetian intelligence apparatus developed sophisticated methods for secure communication that were centuries ahead of their time. The Republic employed some of Europe's most brilliant cryptographers to develop ciphers that protected diplomatic correspondence. Each ambassador received unique encryption keys before departing Venice, allowing them to transmit sensitive information that would appear as nonsensical text if intercepted by rival powers. This early adoption of encryption demonstrates how Venice recognized information security as critical to statecraft. Civilian participation in state security took physical form through the infamous Bocce del Leone, stone lion-head letterboxes installed throughout the city. These lion mouths allowed citizens to anonymously report suspicious activities or potential threats against the Republic. Though this system inevitably invited false accusations and personal vendettas, it created a culture where foreign spies could never feel entirely secure. The psychological effect was profound. Venetians and visitors alike knew they might be observed at any moment. Among Venice's most successful operatives, Giovanni Francesco Morosini distinguished himself through his penetration of Ottoman political circles. After years cultivating relationships in Constantinople, Morosini provided Venice with detailed intelligence on Turkish naval movements during critical periods of Mediterranean conflict. His reports helped the Republic position its fleet strategically, often avoiding direct confrontations where the numerically superior Ottoman navy would have held the advantage. Across the English Channel from Venice, another shadow war was brewing with far higher stakes. While history remembers Elizabeth I's reign for the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the flourishing of Shakespeare, few realize her throne, and possibly England's very existence as a Protestant nation, depended on an extraordinary network of spies and codebreakers orchestrated by one brilliant, paranoid man. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary and spy master, built what historians now recognize as Renaissance Europe's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus. A devout Protestant who had witnessed the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of French Protestants in 1572, Walsingham returned to England with an unwavering conviction. Catholic powers would stop at nothing to destroy Protestant England, and only constant vigilance could prevent it. Unlike Venice's institutionalized system, England's intelligence network was essentially Walsingham's personal creation, operated from his London home on Seething Lane. From this unassuming headquarters, he dispatched agents throughout Europe, particularly targeting the exile communities in France, Spain, and the Low Countries, where Catholic English plotters congregated after fleeing Elizabeth's religious reforms. These exiles, believing Elizabeth a heretic who had usurped the rightful Catholic monarch, became the center of numerous plots to assassinate the Queen and restore Catholicism. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 exemplified the danger. Francis Throckmorton, a Catholic nobleman, coordinated with the Spanish ambassador and Mary, Queen of Scots, to plan a Spanish invasion and Elizabeth's murder. When Walsingham's agents intercepted their communications, Throckmorton was arrested, tortured, and executed. But Walsingham's network extended far beyond conventional spying. He pioneered techniques that would become standard in modern intelligence. He employed numerous double agents, including Gilbert Gifford, who infiltrated Catholic exile circles while reporting their every move to Walsingham. The spy master established Europe's first dedicated decryption department, hiring mathematical geniuses like Thomas Philippe, who could break the most sophisticated ciphers of the age. Philippe's skills proved critical in 1586 when Walsingham orchestrated his greatest triumph. For years, Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and heir, had been under house arrest in England. Walsingham suspected she continued to plot against Elizabeth, but needed evidence. His agents intercepted Mary's communications, carried in beer barrels to avoid detection, and Philippe deciphered her coded letters approving the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Not content with merely intercepting the message, Philippe demonstrated his extraordinary skill by forging Mary's handwriting to add a postscript, asking for the names of the conspirators. When Anthony Babington responded with all the details, Walsingham had the evidence needed to secure Mary's execution and dismantle the threat she represented. The execution of Mary in 1587 triggered the long-feared Spanish invasion attempt. King Philip II dispatched the Spanish Armada in 1588, but Walsingham's network had been reporting on Spanish naval preparations for years. His agents in Spanish ports cataloged ship movements, while others infiltrated shipyards to report on construction. By the time the Armada sailed, Elizabeth's commanders knew the Spanish fleet's capabilities in extraordinary detail, contributing significantly to England's famous victory. The intelligence techniques pioneered by Walsingham would evolve into something far more sprawling when Britain found itself facing a new existential threat, not from Catholic Spain, but from Tsarist Russia's relentless expansion toward India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. For nearly a century, from the early 1800s to the early 1900s, a silent war raged across the deserts, mountains, and steppes of Central Asia. This conflict, which became known as the Great Game, saw neither army directly clash on the battlefield, yet it claimed countless lives and reshaped borders that remain contested to this day. At its core, the Great Game represented Britain's overwhelming fear of Russian encroachment on India. Every Russian territorial gain in Central Asia, each new khanate absorbed, each diplomatic mission established, rang alarm bells in London. The British nightmare scenario was Russian troops marching through Afghanistan and the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush to threaten British India. This perceived threat drove extraordinary espionage efforts spanning thousands of miles of largely unmapped territory. The contest transformed cartography into a weapon of war. Both empires dispatched agents disguised as merchants, pilgrims, and explorers to map previously uncharted regions. Russian military officer Nikolai Przhevalsky led multiple expeditions into Central Asia and Tibet, ostensibly for scientific purposes, but with clear intelligence objectives. His detailed maps of mountain passes and potential invasion routes provided strategic advantage to Russian military planners. Britain countered with its own remarkable spies. Alexander Bukhara Burns traveled through Afghanistan and Bukhara in the 1830s disguised as a horse trader, producing intelligence that directly influenced British policy. Captain Arthur Connolly, who actually coined the term Great Game, operated throughout the region attempting to forge anti-Russian alliances with local rulers. His mission ended tragically in 1842 when the Emir of Bukhara had him beheaded after months of imprisonment in a vermin-infested dungeon. Perhaps the most audacious were the pundits, native Indian surveyors trained by the British to operate in territories too dangerous for Europeans. These agents concealed surveying equipment in Buddhist prayer wheels and rosaries, counting their steps with modified prayer beads to measure distances accurately. They memorized terrain features and recorded observations in coded messages disguised as prayers, mapping vast swaths of Tibet, Central Asia, and Afghanistan with remarkable precision, despite constant danger of execution if discovered. The Great Game wasn't confined to espionage. It erupted into full-scale proxy wars. The First Anglo-Afghan War, from 1839 to 1842, saw Britain attempt to install a puppet ruler in Kabul, only to suffer one of the worst military disasters in its imperial history, when 16,000 soldiers and civilians retreated from the city in January 1842. Only one European, Dr. William Brydon, survived to reach British territory. Undeterred, Britain launched a second Anglo-Afghan War in 1878 after discovering a Russian diplomatic mission in Kabul. Though militarily more successful, Britain ultimately recognized Afghanistan as a buffer state, neither fully controlled by Russia nor Britain. This reflected the Great Game's grand strategy: establishing neutral zones and client states that would absorb potential conflicts before they threatened British India directly. The competition extended to covert diplomacy. Both empires manipulated local rulers through bribes, threats, and promises of protection. They employed teams of cryptographers to intercept and decode diplomatic messages. The British Indian government established a dedicated foreign and political department that essentially functioned as an intelligence agency, managing networks of informants across the region. The legacy of this shadow conflict remains visible today. The Durand Line, drawn in 1893 to mark the boundary between British India and Afghanistan, now forms the contentious border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, splitting Pashtun tribal areas and creating ongoing instability. The artificial borders created during this period planted seeds for conflicts that would erupt during the Cold War and continue into our present century. As artificial borders drawn during the Great Game still fuel modern conflicts, they remind us of an overlooked truth. Empires survive through information as much as conquest. For 4 centuries, one sprawling empire maintained its dominance through a shadow network so effective that historians are only now uncovering its full extent. The Ottoman intelligence apparatus that once reached from Vienna to Persia and beyond. While European powers were developing their espionage capabilities, the Ottoman Empire had already perfected a sophisticated intelligence system that would remain unrivaled until the modern era. At the heart of this network was the Muhim Defteri, a collection of classified intelligence records containing detailed reports from spies embedded throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. These documents reveal an astonishing breadth of Ottoman surveillance, with operatives reporting from the courts of France, the chambers of the Vatican, and the palaces of Safavid Persia. The Ottoman intelligence apparatus reached its early heights under Sultan Selim I and his successor, Suleiman the Magnificent. During these reigns, the empire faced existential threats from the Habsburg dynasty in Europe and the Safavid Empire in Persia. To counter these dangers, Ottoman rulers cultivated networks of informants who provided critical intelligence on military movements, political machinations, and potential alliances against Ottoman interests. Perhaps most remarkable was the Ottomans' use of their elite Janissary Corps for intelligence gathering. While primarily known as the Sultan's feared military force, selected Janissaries received specialized training for covert operations in foreign territories. Their military background provided perfect cover for assessing enemy fortifications and battle readiness, while their status granted them access to influential circles where valuable information could be gleaned. The empire's diplomatic corps served as another crucial intelligence asset. The dragomans, multilingual interpreters who facilitated communication between the Ottoman government and foreign powers, operated as de facto spies. Their linguistic skills and official positions allowed them to move freely between worlds, collecting strategic information while appearing to simply perform their translation duties. Many dragomans came from the Phanariot Greeks of Constantinople, whose education and cultural fluency made them ideal intermediaries. One of the most unexpected sources of Ottoman intelligence came from within the imperial palace itself. The Kizlar Awasi, chief of the imperial harem eunuchs, controlled a shadowy network of informants uniquely positioned to gather intelligence. Enslaved courtiers and concubines from various nations who served foreign dignitaries and emissaries could extract valuable information during intimate moments when guards were down and secrets flowed freely. This pillow intelligence proved remarkably effective, as foreign visitors rarely suspected the harem's dual role in Ottoman statecraft. Ottoman cryptographers developed sophisticated methods to intercept and decode diplomatic correspondence between European powers. The empire maintained dedicated decryption bureaus in Constantinople and major provincial capitals, where specialists worked to break foreign ciphers. These efforts yielded significant intelligence coups, particularly during periods of European coalition building against Ottoman interests. By the 19th century, as the empire began to weaken, Ottoman intelligence underwent modernization to counter growing European influence. The empire established formal intelligence departments modeled partly on Western agencies, but maintaining distinctive Ottoman methods. During the Crimean War, Ottoman counterintelligence successfully identified and neutralized numerous Russian operatives working in Constantinople and the Balkans. This centuries-old intelligence apparatus reached its final form during World War I, when Ottoman intelligence collaborated closely with German agencies against British and Russian operations. The partnership led to several notable successes, including the interception of Allied plans for the Gallipoli campaign, though this information was not fully utilized by Ottoman military leadership. The German-Ottoman intelligence partnership was just one facet of a broader shadow war unfolding across global communication networks during World War I. In January 1917, a seemingly routine diplomatic message would trigger a cascade of events that fundamentally altered the course of the conflict and revealed how even the most secure channels could be compromised with devastating consequences. At the height of submarine warfare in the Atlantic, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman authorized what would become history's most catastrophic diplomatic blunder. With Germany planning to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision certain to antagonize the neutral United States, Zimmerman conceived a bold strategic gambit to keep America occupied should it enter the war. He drafted a telegram proposing an alliance between Germany and Mexico, offering to help Mexico reclaim territories lost to the United States in the 1840s: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The message's journey was as complex as its contents were explosive. Unable to send it directly across the Atlantic where British ships had cut German underwater cables early in the war, Zimmerman relied on a circuitous route. The telegram traveled through the U.S. State Department's communication system, an arrangement President Wilson had permitted for German diplomatic messages as part of his neutrality policy, before reaching the German ambassador in Mexico City, Heinrich von Eckhardt. What Zimmerman didn't know was that British naval intelligence had been monitoring these transmissions. In a nondescript building in London, cryptanalysts in Room 40, the Admiralty's top-secret code-breaking division, intercepted the message on January 17, 1917. Under the leadership of Captain Reginald Blinker Hall, this elite team had already broken German diplomatic codes, allowing them to decipher Zimmerman's instructions. Captain Hall immediately recognized the telegram's potential to shift American opinion toward war, but faced a critical dilemma. Revealing the telegram would expose Britain's code-breaking capabilities and compromise future intelligence gathering. Moreover, admitting Britain had intercepted messages passing through American diplomatic channels could anger Wilson's administration. Hall devised an ingenious solution. Room 40 arranged for a copy of the encoded telegram to be stolen in Mexico, creating the impression it had been intercepted there, rather than from American diplomatic channels. The British then presented the telegram to American officials as though it had been acquired through conventional espionage, rather than cryptanalysis. When the telegram's contents became public on March 1, 1917, the American reaction was swift and furious. Newspapers across the country ran inflammatory headlines about German plots against American territory. Even skeptics who initially suspected British fabrication were silenced when Zimmerman himself inexplicably confirmed the telegram's authenticity at a press conference on March 3rd, compounding his diplomatic disaster. The telegram's timing proved particularly damaging for Germany. It arrived as tensions were already escalating over German submarine attacks on American shipping. For President Wilson, who had won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," the Zimmerman telegram represented the final provocation. On April 2nd, he requested a declaration of war against Germany, which Congress approved 4 days later. The injection of fresh American troops, industrial capacity, and financial resources into the Allied war effort ultimately proved decisive, turning the tide against Germany and the Central Powers. What began as a diplomatic initiative intended to keep America distracted instead hastened Germany's defeat and reshaped the global power structure. As the Zimmerman telegram backfired catastrophically in the West, Germany was simultaneously executing what might be history's most successful intelligence operation on their Eastern Front, using just one man in a sealed train to topple an empire and change the world forever. While German diplomacy failed spectacularly with Mexico, a brilliant strategic chess move against Russia would yield extraordinary results. In April 1917, as America prepared to enter the war, German intelligence orchestrated the return of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin to Russia from his exile in Switzerland. Lenin wasn't merely transported. He was delivered like a precision-guided weapon in a sealed train car across German territory, with German military officials ensuring his safe passage to the Finnish border. This wasn't ordinary diplomatic courtesy. The operation, meticulously planned by German intelligence service Abteilung 3B under the approval of General Erich Ludendorff, represented a calculated gamble: deliver a revolutionary leader who could potentially destabilize Russia from within. The Germans provided Lenin with approximately 40 million gold marks, roughly $1 billion in today's currency, to fund revolutionary activities. The logic behind Germany's strategy was ruthlessly pragmatic. By 1917, the Eastern Front had tied down over 1 million German troops. If Russia could be knocked out of the war, those forces could be redeployed to the Western Front before American troops arrived in significant numbers. The February Revolution had already toppled Tsar Nicholas II, but the Democratic Provisional Government under Alexander Kerensky remained committed to continuing the war against Germany. German funding flowed through complex channels to reach Lenin's Bolsheviks. Swedish banker Olof Aschberg played a crucial role, with German funds passing through his Nya Banken in Stockholm before reaching revolutionary hands in Petrograd. This money financed the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, paid for weapons, and supported agitators who spread anti-war propaganda amongst exhausted Russian soldiers and hungry civilians. The German operation wasn't limited to Lenin alone. They facilitated the return of other revolutionary exiles and maintained a network of agents who reported on Russia's deteriorating internal solution. Karl Mohr, a German agent posing as a Swiss socialist, worked as an intermediary between German intelligence and the Bolsheviks, ensuring money reached the right hands while maintaining plausible deniability. The investment paid extraordinary dividends. Within 7 months of Lenin's arrival, the Bolsheviks had seized power in the October Revolution, which actually occurred in November 1917 by the Western calendar. One of Lenin's first acts was to issue the Decree on Peace, calling for immediate negotiations with Germany. By March 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russia's participation in World War I. The terms were devastating for Russia. The treaty forced the new Soviet government to surrender control of Finland, the Baltic states, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and the Caucasus region. Approximately 1 million square miles of territory containing around a third of Russia's population, a third of its agricultural land, and 3/4 of its iron and coal production. For Germany, this represented a staggering return on investment, achieving through subversion what years of bloody warfare had failed to accomplish. General Max Hoffmann, who negotiated the treaty for Germany, later remarked, "We neither made the revolution nor bribed it. We only infected Russia with the bacillus which was already here, just like we sent Lenin to Russia." This backhanded admission reveals both Germany's role and their attempt to minimize it, a stance that would be maintained for decades. Germany's revolutionary bacillus in Russia marked just the beginning of a new era in global conflict. In the supposed peace that followed World War I, intelligence agencies across the globe were silently building the networks, technologies, and methods that would shape the coming century, creating a hidden battlefield where no declaration of war was needed to strike devastating blows against rival powers. The interwar period saw intelligence operations transform from wartime necessities into permanent institutions. Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, formalized in 1919 under Sir Mansfield Cumming, known simply as C, expanded rapidly to monitor the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. MI6 established stations in major European capitals, with officers operating under diplomatic cover as they tracked the growth of paramilitary organizations like the Nazi Sturmabteilung, or SA, and the later Schutzstaffel, SS. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence underwent dramatic evolution. The NKVD, or People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, built an unprecedented foreign espionage apparatus focused on technological theft and ideological infiltration. Their greatest triumph came through recruiting idealistic students at Britain's elite Cambridge University. The infamous Cambridge Five, Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, began their journey as Soviet assets during this period, eventually reaching positions where they could access the most sensitive Western intelligence. The Soviet Union also pioneered what would later be called hybrid warfare through Operation Z from 1937 to 1941. While maintaining official neutrality in the Sino-Japanese conflict, Moscow covertly deployed over 3,600 military advisors and 885 aircraft with Soviet pilots to support Chinese forces against Japanese aggression. These volunteer pilots flew combat missions in Chinese-marked planes, while Soviet ships delivered essential military supplies through Central Asia. Japan's own intelligence apparatus focused on expansionist ambitions throughout Asia. The Kempeitai, or military police, and the Naval Intelligence Bureau established networks of spies and informants throughout China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Japanese agents meticulously documented harbor depths, coastal defenses, and transportation infrastructure that would later facilitate their lightning conquests in 1941 and 1942. In Germany, intelligence operations reflected Nazi ideology's paranoid worldview. The Gestapo, or secret state police, under Heimlich Himmler, hunted domestic enemies, while the Abwehr, military intelligence, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, gathered foreign intelligence. Despite Canaris's personal misgivings about Hitler, The Abwehr pioneered industrial espionage techniques, stealing technical secrets from across Europe and America to support German rearmament. Their agents photographed factory layouts, bribed engineers, and smuggled prototype designs, accelerating Germany's military modernization. America's approach to intelligence remained remarkably underdeveloped during this period. The State Department maintained a small cipher bureau until Secretary of State Henry Stimson famously shut it down in 1929, declaring that, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." Military intelligence remained minimal, with the Army's G2 and Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence operating on shoestring budgets. This intelligence gap would prove catastrophic at Pearl Harbor and necessitate the wartime creation of the Office of Strategic Services. Perhaps most consequential was the interwar rise of technological espionage. Germany's theft of French military designs, Britain's interception of Italian diplomatic communications, and Russia's industrial espionage created a shadow arms race that accelerated technological development. Nations stole everything from aircraft engines to chemical formulas, while implementing innovations faster than their originators. As the technological shadow wars of the interwar period evolved into open conflict, Nazi Germany was already planning for what would come after their defeat. In the dying days of the Third Reich, while Allied forces advanced on Berlin, Hitler's lieutenants were burying weapons caches and organizing a network that would haunt occupation forces long after Germany's official surrender. In September 1944, Heinrich Himmler authorized the formation of Operation Werewolf, named after the mythological Germanic werewolf, a fitting symbol for fighters who would emerge from hiding to strike terror into occupation forces. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Preutzmann, a former higher SS and police leader in Ukraine, was appointed to lead this desperate last measure, drawing on his experience fighting Soviet partisans on the Eastern Front. Training facilities were established in Hülkrath Castle near Erkelenz and in Lübbecke, where selected Hitler Youth members and SS officers received hurry instruction in sabotage, explosives handling, and guerrilla tactics. The program crafted a disturbing vision. German civilians would become instruments of terror against occupiers and collaborators. Unlike conventional resistance movements formed by conquered peoples in other European nations, Werewolf represented the death throes of the Nazi regime, a refusal to accept defeat by transforming civilians into weapons. The enemy spies among us. Women, children, and old men must support our fighters. The enemy should feel that he is not safe anywhere. He should be pursued and liquidated wherever caught, proclaimed Radio Werewolf in its April 1, 1945 inaugural broadcast. This Nazi-controlled station operated from a mobile transmitter, broadcasting inflammatory messages urging Germans to poison Allied troops and murder collaborators. Goebbels seized upon Werewolf as a propaganda opportunity, exaggerating its strength and capabilities to boost civilian morale and intimidate Allied forces. His propaganda ministry distributed pamphlets with explicit instructions for sabotage and assassination, alongside stories of successful werewolf attacks that often never occurred. This deliberate myth-making had real consequences. Allied forces became deeply suspicious of German civilians, sometimes responding with harsh occupation measures that only strengthened resentment. The reality of Werewolf fell far short of its fearsome propaganda image. While underground bunkers were stocked with weapons, explosives, and food supplies throughout the Reich, the anticipated mass resistance never materialized. Most Germans, exhausted by years of war and bombing, wanted peace rather than continued conflict. The rigid, hierarchical nature of Nazi operations proved ill-suited for decentralized guerrilla operations, with most cells lacking proper coordination or communication. Nevertheless, werewolf operations weren't entirely fictional. On March 25, 1945, a werewolf commando team successfully assassinated Franz Oppenhoff, the American-appointed mayor of Aachen. The team, which included a former Hitler youth leader and an SS officer disguised in Luftwaffe uniforms, parachuted near the Belgian-German border to carry out this symbolic killing. In Penzberg, Bavaria, werewolf operatives executed the mayor and several other officials who had attempted to surrender the town peacefully to American forces. Allied intelligence took the werewolf threat seriously. The OSS and Soviet NKVD launched extensive counterinsurgency operations, arresting thousands of suspected operatives and interrogating former Hitler Youth members. American counterintelligence corps officers conducted raids on suspected weapons caches, uncovering buried arsenals of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, explosives, and ammunition stores. While Allied forces were dismantling the last remnants of Nazi Germany's werewolf program, they were simultaneously laying the foundations for their own secret stay-behind networks across Europe. Beginning in the late 1940s, NATO established what would become known as Operation Gladio, a clandestine paramilitary organization designed to activate in case of Soviet occupation of Western Europe. Unlike the hastily organized Nazi resistance plan, Gladio was meticulously structured and extensively funded. The CIA and British MI6 methodically recruited, trained, and equipped thousands of operatives across Western Europe, many of whom were ordinary citizens living double lives as shopkeepers, policemen, lawyers, and journalists. Their identities remained unknown even to their families, with many taking their secrets to the grave. The strategic brilliance of Gladio lay in its compartmentalized structure. Each national branch operated independently, with code names varying by country. Gladio was Italy, Absalon in Denmark, ROC in Norway, P-26 in Switzerland, and SDR-A8 in Belgium. This segmentation ensured that the compromise of one cell wouldn't endanger the entire network. These operatives underwent specialized training in remote facilities, learning advanced guerrilla tactics, sabotage techniques, and covert communications. NATO intelligence agencies established thousands of weapons caches throughout Europe, hidden in forests, underground bunkers, and abandoned buildings. These arsenals contained everything from small arms and explosives to sophisticated radio equipment, ready to be activated if Soviets pushed westward. By the 1960s, however, the original defensive purpose of Gladio began to transform. As the immediate threat of Soviet invasion diminished, some Gladio units allegedly shifted focus to countering domestic communist movements. This mission creep pulled certain elements of the network into the turbulent politics of Cold War Europe, particularly in Italy during the Years of Lead. In Italy, magistrates investigating terrorist attacks found troubling connections between Gladio operatives and right-wing extremist groups. The 1972 Pedeano car bombing, which killed 3 Carabinieri officers, was initially blamed on leftist terrorists. Years later, right-wing extremist Vincenzo Vinciguerra confessed to the attack and alleged Gladio's involvement in a strategy of tension designed to create fear and push public opinion towards support for stronger state authority. The 1980 Bologna railway station bombing, which killed 85 people and wounded over 200, represents the most devastating attack linked to this strategy. While the perpetrators were identified as neo-fascist terrorists, subsequent investigations suggested connections to elements within Italy's military intelligence and, potentially, to Gladio structures. Similar patterns emerged across Europe. In Belgium, parliamentary investigations examined possible links between Gladio units and the Brabant killers, who conducted a series of seemingly random supermarket attacks in the 1980s, killing 28 people. In Greece, former Gladio operatives allegedly participated in the 1967 military coup that installed a right-wing junta for 7 years. The existence of these secret armies remained hidden until 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stunned Europe by acknowledging Gladio's existence. His revelation triggered a cascade of admissions from other European governments and a formal inquiry by the European Parliament. The resulting 1990 resolution strongly condemned the existence for 40 years of a clandestine parallel intelligence and armed operations organization that escaped all democratic controls. As the OSS evolved from countering Nazi insurgents in Europe, America's newly formed Central Intelligence Agency was already preparing for its next shadow war. While American intelligence forces were uncovering Nazi weapon caches in Germany, halfway across the world, they were busy creating hidden arsenals of their own. In the high mountains of Tibet, the CIA would soon deploy the counterinsurgency expertise gained in post-war Europe against a new ideological enemy. When Mao Zedong's communist forces seized control of mainland China in 1949, they quickly set their sights on Tibet. By October 1950, 40,000 People's Liberation Army troops crossed into eastern Tibet, overwhelming the poorly equipped Tibetan army. Within months, Tibet's government was forced to sign the 17-point agreement, which acknowledged Chinese sovereignty while promising Tibetan autonomy, promises Beijing would soon break. The CIA spotted an opportunity in the brewing resistance. Under the codename Saint Circus, the agency began identifying potential Tibetan recruits from among refugees fleeing to India and Nepal. They specifically targeted the Khampa warriors from eastern Tibet, known for their fierce independence and fighting traditions. Selected fighters were secretly flown to Saipan in the Pacific for initial assessment, then to Camp Hale, Colorado, for comprehensive training. Camp Hale, nestled in the Rocky Mountains at 10,000 feet elevation, provided terrain remarkably similar to Tibet. There, Tibetan fighters received intensive training in guerrilla warfare tactics, explosives handling, intelligence gathering, and radio communications. The secrecy was so complete that even the instructors often didn't know their trainees' identities or mission details. Meanwhile, in Tibet, Chinese authorities intensified control, dismantling monasteries and forcing collectivization policies that violated traditional Tibetan culture. The resistance movement Chushi Gandruk, or Four Rivers, Six Ranges, organized in response, with CIA-trained operatives serving as its backbone. By 1958, the agency began parachute drops of weapons, ammunition, and supplies to resistance fighters operating in remote mountain regions. The operation reached a critical juncture in March 1959, when tensions exploded into a full-scale uprising in Lhasa. As Chinese forces surrounded the Dalai Lama's summer palace, the CIA facilitated his dramatic escape. The 23-year-old spiritual leader, disguised as a soldier, slipped out of Lhasa under cover of darkness with a small entourage. For 2 weeks, they trekked through treacherous Himalayan passages while Chinese forces hunted them. CIA-trained Tibetan operatives guided the party, maintaining radio contact with handlers who coordinated the escape route. When the Dalai Lama finally crossed into India on March 31, 1959, it represented one of the CIA's most successful extraction operations. The Chinese response was brutal. PLA forces killed an estimated 87,000 Tibetans in the aftermath of the uprising, with thousands more imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Despite these losses, CIA-supported resistance continued. From bases in Mustang, Nepal, Tibetan fighters conducted cross-border raids, ambushing Chinese convoys and gathering intelligence on PLA movements. Throughout the 1960s, the CIA airdropped approximately 400 tons of equipment to Tibetan resistance forces. However, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. By the late 1960s, American foreign policy priorities were dominated by Vietnam and a potential opening to China. As Nixon and Kissinger began secretly negotiating with Beijing, Tibet became a diplomatic liability. In 1969, direct CIA support for Tibetan operations began winding down. By 1974, all assistance had ceased. The agency sent final payments to fighters, effectively abandoning a resistance it had cultivated for nearly 2 decades. Many Tibetan veterans felt betrayed, having sacrificed everything for a cause they believed America supported. Several former resistance members were captured and executed when they attempted to continue operations without external support. In 1960, as the Congo celebrated its independence from Belgium, Western intelligence agencies were already plotting its downfall, targeting a single man whose vision threatened billions in mineral wealth. On June 30, 1960, the Belgian Congo gained independence after 75 years of brutal colonial rule. Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic postal worker turned politician, became the nation's first democratically elected prime minister. His inaugural speech, delivered in the presence of Belgium's King Baudouin, shocked the Western world. Instead of offering platitudes of gratitude, Lumumba boldly condemned the colonial atrocities committed against his people. "We are no longer your monkeys," he declared, signaling his intention to chart a truly independent course for his resource-rich nation. Within days, chaos erupted. The Congolese army mutinied against its Belgian officers. Belgium, claiming to protect European citizens, deployed troops without the new government's permission. Most significantly, Moise Tshombe, backed by Belgian mining interests, declared the mineral-rich Katanga province independent. Katanga contains 70% of the Congo's mineral wealth, including vast deposits of copper, cobalt, and uranium, the same uranium that had supplied America's Manhattan Project. The stakes couldn't have been higher. At the height of the Cold War, Western powers feared Lumumba might nationalize these strategic resources, or worse, allow Soviet influence over them. When Lumumba requested UN assistance to restore order, Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld mobilized a peacekeeping mission. Frustrated by the UN's reluctance to help reunify the country, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for military aid. This decision sealed his fate. CIA Director Allen Dulles sent a fatal cable identifying Lumumba as a Castro or worse, and authorizing his elimination. Documents later revealed the CIA had developed a plot to poison Lumumba, even sending toxic biological materials to their station in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa. While this particular plot wasn't executed, Western powers found willing accomplices in Colonel Joseph Mobutu, Lumumba's military chief, and Belgian operatives. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu staged a coup with CIA backing, temporarily neutralizing Lumumba. When Lumumba attempted to reach his stronghold in Stanleyville, he was captured by Mobutu's forces on December 1st. The following month, Belgian officials arranged his transfer to Katanga, where Belgian officers supervised his torture and execution. Belgian Police Commissioner Gerard Souet later admitted to dismembering Lumumba's body and dissolving it in acid to eliminate evidence. The only remains, a gold-crowned tooth, was finally returned to Lumumba's family in 2022, 61 years after his murder. The aftermath was devastating. The Congo descended into a civil war that killed an estimated 100,000 people. Western mining interests maintain access to Congolese minerals, while UN Secretary-General Hammarskjöld died in a suspicious plane crash while negotiating peace, an incident many historians now suspect was an assassination. In 1965, Mobutu seized complete power in another CIA-backed coup, establishing a 32-year kleptocracy that embezzled billions while serving as a loyal Cold War ally to Western powers. The Congo crisis represented a brutal template that would be replicated throughout the developing world. When democratically elected leaders threatened Western economic interests, intelligence agencies orchestrated their removal and replacement with compliant autocrats. The price was paid by ordinary citizens who endured decades of oppression while their nation's wealth flowed overseas. In the early 1950s, a scenario was unfolding that Iran would become a textbook example of covert intervention. The country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had become a thorn in the side of Western powers, particularly Britain. His cardinal sin? Nationalizing Iran's oil industry in 1951, wresting control from the Anglo-Iranian oil company that had exploited the country's resources for decades while sharing minimal profits with the Iranian people. This nationalization wasn't simply a business dispute. It represented something far more threatening to Western interests, a Middle Eastern nation asserting control over its own resources. The British government, facing the loss of what they considered their rightful petroleum assets, initially attempted an economic blockade. When that failed to bring Mossadegh to heel, they turned to their American allies with a proposal for more drastic action. The Cold War context proved crucial. Though Mossadegh wasn't a communist, he was actually a secular nationalist from an aristocratic background. The Eisenhower administration grew increasingly concerned about Soviet influence in the region. CIA Director Allen Dulles and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, convinced President Eisenhower that Mossadegh's Iran might fall into the Soviet orbit if left unchecked. Operation Ajax, as the covert action was codenamed, became one of the CIA's first major regime change operations. Under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, the CIA deployed a remarkably small team to Tehran with a substantial budget, reportedly around $1 million, equivalent to about $10 million today, to orchestrate what would appear to be a popular uprising. The operation's playbook was sophisticated. CIA operatives bribed members of the Iranian parliament, military officials, religious leaders, communists, and journalists. They planted false stories in newspapers portraying Mossadegh as corrupt, communist-leading, and even Jewish, a calculated smear in a predominantly Muslim country. They hired street thugs to pose as communist demonstrators, creating chaos, then paid other crowds to attack these communists, creating an impression of civil unrest. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, initially hesitated to participate in the plot. Roosevelt had to persuade him that the coup would succeed, ultimately convincing him to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as prime minister. When the first attempt failed, the Shah fled to Rome, believing the operation doomed. Yet Roosevelt persisted, organizing larger demonstrations that eventually succeeded. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah forces overtook Tehran. Mossadegh was arrested, later tried for treason, and sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement. Upon release, he remained under house arrest until his death in 1967. The aftermath transformed Iran. The Shah returned to power with American backing, implementing a 25-year agreement that gave Western companies control of Iranian oil, with profits split between several companies. The U.S. received a 40% share for its role in the coup. The Shah established Shavak, a notorious secret police organization trained by the CIA and Israeli intelligence, which tortured and executed thousands of political opponents over the following decades. For ordinary Iranians, the coup represented a profound betrayal. A democratic experiment that had been crushed by foreign powers interested primarily in oil and geopolitical advantage. While the operation succeeded in its immediate goals, it planted deep seeds of resentment that would later bloom into revolution. In the chaotic final days of World War II, as Allied forces swept across Nazi Germany, an entirely different kind of battle was unfolding behind the scenes. American intelligence officers were racing against their Soviet counterparts to capture the Third Reich's greatest scientific minds. The prize wasn't just the scientists themselves, but the revolutionary technologies they had developed under Hitler's regime, technologies that would soon reshape the post-war world. Operation Paperclip began in 1945 when the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency started identifying German scientists who could benefit American military and scientific programs. What made this operation controversial wasn't just that these were enemy scientists, it was that many were ardent Nazis with blood on their hands. The very scientists who had helped build Hitler's war machine were about to be welcomed into America with open arms. The scientists targeted weren't just any researchers. They represented the elite of German scientific achievement. Arthur Rudolph had overseen V-2 rocket production at the Mittelwerk facility, where thousands of slave laborers died. Walter Schreiber had conducted cruel medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Kurt Blom had developed chemical weapons and tested them on human subjects. These weren't merely passive Nazi Party members. Many were active participants in some of the regime's darkest atrocities. The moral compromise at the heart of Operation Paperclip became evident in the paperwork itself. American officials created sanitized personnel files for these scientists, carefully removing references to Nazi Party membership, SS affiliations, and war crimes investigations. The paper trail of atrocities was literally erased with a paperclip, holding a new, cleansed biography, hence the operation's codename. President Truman had initially ordered that no Nazi Party members or active supporters of Nazi militarism be brought to America. Yet the JIOA and the military officials overseeing the program routinely circumvented this directive, believing that scientific genius trumped moral considerations. They argued that if America didn't secure these mines, the Soviets would, a rationale that proved compelling in the early Cold War atmosphere. The scientific dividends of Operation Paperclip were undeniable. Hubertus Strughold's work in space medicine helped American astronauts survive in space. Kurt Debus became a founding director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Walter Dornberger's missile expertise informed America's early ICBM programs. But perhaps none proved more valuable than Werner von Braun. Von Braun, who had been an SS officer personally approved by Heinrich Himmler, had overseen the V-2 rocket program using slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Yet, within a decade, this former Nazi rocketed to American celebrity, appearing on popular television programs and eventually becoming the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that would carry Apollo astronauts to the moon. His rehabilitation in the American public eye represented the strange contradiction of Operation Paperclip, celebrating scientific genius while deliberately overlooking horrific pasts. Meanwhile, the Soviets conducted their own version through Operation Osso Aviacum, forcibly relocating over 2,200 German specialists to work on Soviet military and scientific projects. Unlike the Americans, who offered their German recruits comfortable lives and citizenship, the Soviets often kept their German scientists under close surveillance in restricted areas. The human cost of these morally compromised decisions extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Holocaust survivors and former slave laborers were horrified to learn that their tormentors had been given comfortable government positions in America. Victims of Nazi medical experiments would never see justice for the crimes committed against them, as many perpetrators now worked in American medical research facilities under government protection. In May 1960, as diplomatic tensions between the United States and Soviet Union seemed to be thawing, an unexpected crisis reignited Cold War hostilities to dangerous levels. High above the skies of Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, Russia, American pilot Francis Gary Powers was executing what should have been another routine reconnaissance mission in his U-2 spy plane. For years, these sleek, black aircraft had been the crown jewels of America's intelligence program, soaring at altitudes of 70,000 feet, well beyond the reach of Soviet anti-aircraft weapons and interceptor jets. Or so the Americans believed. The U-2 program, codenamed Aquatone and later Chalice, had begun in 1954 under President Eisenhower's authorization. The CIA and Lockheed's Skunk Works had developed these remarkable aircraft specifically to photograph Soviet military installations, missile sites, and nuclear facilities from altitudes that seemed untouchable. With their glider-like wings spanning 80 feet and specialized cameras capable of resolving objects as small as 4 inches from 13 miles up, the U-2s had conducted over 20 successful flights over Soviet territory since 1956, providing crucial intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. What American intelligence failed to anticipate was the rapid advancement of Soviet anti-aircraft technology. That fateful May Day, the Soviets were ready. As Powers traversed Soviet airspace, a battery of newly developed S-75 Venus surface-to-air missiles, known to NATO as SA-2 Guideline, was launched to intercept him. Although the first missile missed, it damaged Powers' aircraft with its proximity blast. A second missile struck close enough to the U-2 to cause catastrophic damage, forcing Powers to eject at 70,000 feet. Contrary to CIA instructions, he was unable to activate the aircraft's self-destruct mechanism before abandoning it. What followed was a diplomatic disaster of epic proportions. The Eisenhower administration, unaware that Powers had survived and been captured, issued a cover story claiming that a NASA weather research plane had strayed off course due to pilot oxygen difficulties. To support this fiction, the U.S. hastily painted a U-2 in NASA colors and presented it to the media. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a masterful political game. Initially, he simply announced that an American plane had been shot down, deliberately withholding the fact that they had captured the pilot alive. This tactical delay allowed the Americans to entangle themselves further in their fabricated narrative. Days later, Khrushchev revealed his trump card. Not only was Powers alive, but much of the spy plane's sophisticated equipment had been recovered intact, including the high-resolution cameras with their damning photographs of Soviet military installations. The timing couldn't have been worse. A crucial four-power summit in Paris, years in the planning, was set to begin on May 16th. The meeting, which many hoped would ease Cold War tensions and address the ongoing Berlin crisis, instead became a diplomatic catastrophe. Khrushchev demanded an apology from Eisenhower, who refused to provide one. The Soviet leader stormed out of the conference, effectively ending any chance for improved relations during Eisenhower's presidency. For Powers, the nightmare was just beginning. After a very public show trial in Moscow, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 7 years of hard labor. The Soviet propaganda machine worked overtime, presenting Powers as evidence of America's duplicity and aggression. The pilot would ultimately serve 21 months before being exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel on February 10, 1962, in a dramatic prisoner swap on the Galenicki Bridge connecting East and West Berlin, a crossing that would later become known as the Bridge of Spies. While spies were being exchanged across the Iron Curtain in 1962, another Cold War plot was brewing within America's own military establishment, one so extreme it would have turned Americans themselves into unwitting victims. Just weeks after Powers and Abel walked across that Berlin Bridge, a memo circulated through the highest levels of the Pentagon that contained proposals so shocking they remained hidden from public view for over 3 decades. The document was titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, but history now knows it as Operation Northwoods. Drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and signed by their chairman, General Lyman Lemnitzer, this detailed plan proposed something almost unimaginable: orchestrating terrorist attacks against American citizens and interests to be falsely blamed on Fidel Castro's Cuba. The military strategists who conceived Northwoods were desperate to remove the communist regime just 90 miles from Florida's shores. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had embarrassed the military brass, who now sought a more compelling justification for armed intervention. Their solution was manufactured crisis, engineered tragedies that would generate the public outrage needed to support all-out war. The proposals were meticulously outlined across 13 pages. American military personnel would pose as Cuban agents to bomb U.S. installations. Civilian aircraft would be hijacked. An American ship in Guantanamo Bay would be sabotaged, with blame placed on Cuban forces. Perhaps most disturbing was the suggestion to develop a, quote, communist Cuban terror campaign in major U.S. cities and even in Washington, D.C. One particularly chilling scenario involved the planned destruction of a chartered civil aircraft. As the document stated, the plane would be loaded with, quote, selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. This aircraft would rendezvous with a drone, an unmanned duplicate, over the Florida coast. The passenger plane would land secretly, while the drone would continue transmitting the scheduled flight's call sign. When over Cuban waters, a radio signal would destroy the drone, and pre-prepared evidence would implicate Cuban missiles. The architects of this scheme even planned fake funerals for non-existent victims. Operation Northwoods represented the darkest extremes of Cold War thinking, the notion that American lives could be sacrificed as pawns in a larger geopolitical contest. When President Kennedy reviewed these proposals in March 1962, he rejected them outright. Kennedy, who had already weathered the Bay of Pigs disaster and the Berlin crisis, recognized the moral bankruptcy and extraordinary risk inherent in such deception. Not long after, he removed General Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. For decades, Operation Northwoods remained hidden, classified as top secret, and shielded from congressional oversight and public scrutiny. It wasn't until 1997 that the document was declassified as part of a release of records related to the Kennedy assassination. The revelation stunned historians and the American public alike, revealing how close the nation had come to employing tactics usually associated with totalitarian regimes. The exposure of Northwoods has cast a long shadow over subsequent American military interventions. It has fueled speculation about other potential false flag operations throughout history and raised questions about what additional plans may still remain classified. From the ashes of rejected conspiracy like Operation Northwoods emerged a different kind of governmental deception in the 1980s, one where weapons flowed to an enemy nation, money disappeared into Swiss bank accounts, and documents were shredded as fast as they could be printed. The Iran-Contra Affair wasn't just another political scandal. It represented something far more troubling, a shadow government operating beyond the reach of congressional oversight. At the heart of Iran-Contra was a complex web of illegal operations carried out during President Ronald Reagan's administration. The scandal emerged from two seemingly unrelated foreign policy challenges: the Nicaraguan Civil War and American hostages held in Lebanon. On one side, the Reagan administration was determined to support the Contras, right-wing rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government, despite explicit congressional prohibitions. The Boland Amendment, passed between 1982 and 1984, had categorically banned U.S. military aid to these fighters. Simultaneously, 7 American hostages were being held by Hezbollah militants in Lebanon, a group with close ties to Iran. The administration saw an opportunity to solve both problems through an elaborate scheme: secretly sell weapons to Iran, itself under a U.S. arms embargo, in exchange for assistance in securing the hostages' release, then divert the profits to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, effectively circumventing Congress. This audacious plan was executed primarily through the National Security Council, where Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North became the central operational figure. North, working with National Security Advisor John Poindexter and with the knowledge of CIA Director William Casey, established an elaborate financial network to channel the proceeds from the arms sales. The operation utilized Swiss bank accounts, shell companies, and intermediaries like arms dealer Manicur Gorbanifar to hide the money trail. Between 1985 and 1986, the U.S. shipped over 2,000 TOW anti-tank missiles and various Hawk anti-aircraft missile parts to Iran. The Iranians paid inflated prices for these weapons, with the excess profits, approximately $30 million, secretly diverted to fund the Contras. This enterprise, as North called it, operated as a privatized foreign policy apparatus outside governmental oversight. The carefully constructed house of cards collapsed on October 5, 1986, when a C-123 cargo plane was shot down over Nicaragua. The sole survivor, Eugene Hasenfuss, admitted to working for the CIA, exposing the covert American operation. A month later, a Lebanese magazine, Al-Shura, published an explosive story revealing the secret arms deals with Iran. The twin revelations converged, exposing the full scope of the scandal. As investigations by Congress and independent counsel Lawrence Walsh gained momentum, a frantic cover-up ensued. North and his secretary, Fawn Hall, worked through the night shredding incriminating documents. During congressional testimony, North appeared in his Marine uniform, unapologetically defending his actions as patriotic while admitting to lying to Congress. John Poindexter claimed he deliberately kept President Reagan uninformed to provide, quote, plausible deniability. The televised hearings riveted the nation for months, revealing a constitutional crisis where unelected officials had essentially created their own foreign policy. Admiral Poindexter testified, quote, I made a deliberate decision not to ask the president so that I could insulate him from the decision and provide some future deniability. This admission raised profound questions about accountability in a democratic system. Ultimately, 14 officials faced criminal charges. North was convicted of 3 felonies, including obstruction of justice, but his conviction was later overturned on a technicality. Poindexter was convicted of 5 counts, including conspiracy and lying to Congress, but his conviction was also reversed. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger faced charges but received a pardon from President George H.W. Bush before trial, along with 5 other officials, effectively ending the investigation. In December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, prompting President Jimmy Carter to sign a directive authorizing covert assistance to anti-communist insurgents. What began as a modest program providing $500,000 in non-lethal aid would evolve into Operation Cyclone, a massive, multi-billion-dollar effort to arm and train Afghan resistance fighters known as Mujahideen. The operations mastermind, CIA Director William Casey, saw Afghanistan as the perfect opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union dry. Quote, "We have the opportunity of giving the USSR their Vietnam," Casey told President Reagan. The administration embraced this strategy, dramatically expanding funding for the Afghan resistance year after year. By 1987, the annual budget for Operation Cyclone had ballooned to over $700 million, more than any other CIA covert operations worldwide combined. Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson became the operation's unlikely champion, leveraging his position on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee to secure ever-increasing funds. After witnessing the Afghan refugees' plight firsthand, Wilson became obsessed with the Mujahideen cause, famously telling colleagues, quote, "These things happened. They were glorious and they changed the world." The logistics of Operation Cyclone presented enormous challenges. To maintain plausible deniability, the CIA channeled weapons and funds through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. This arrangement gave Pakistani intelligence near complete control over which Afghan factions received American support. The ISI consistently favored the most radical Islamist groups, particularly those led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, known for his anti-Western views and brutal tactics. Saudi Arabia matched U.S. contributions dollar for dollar, with much of their funding flowing to foreign fighters joining the Afghan jihad. Among them was a young Saudi construction heir named Osama bin Laden, who established training camps and recruiting networks that would later form al-Qaeda's foundation. The introduction of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles in 1986 marked a turning point in the conflict. Previously, Soviet helicopter gunships had dominated the battlefield, but Stingers gave the Mujahideen a way to neutralize this advantage. Within weeks, the resistance fighters shot down their first helicopter. By war's end, they had destroyed over 270 Soviet aircraft, forcing dramatic changes in Soviet air operations. As Soviet forces withdrew in February 1989, CIA officials celebrated what seemed like a perfect victory. The Soviets had lost approximately 15,000 troops, with another 35,000 wounded. The financial cost to Moscow was estimated at $8 billion annually, a significant factor in the USSR's economic collapse 2 years later. But Afghanistan was left in ruins. Over 1 million Afghans had died, with another 5 million becoming refugees. The country's infrastructure was decimated, its economy shattered, and its society militarized. With the Soviets gone, the U.S. quickly lost interest. Aid was slashed, diplomats withdrew, and Afghanistan descended into brutal civil war. With the Soviets gone from Afghanistan, the world's attention simply moved elsewhere, a convenience all too common when it comes to covert operations. 3 decades earlier, another inconvenient situation was possibly resolved when a plane carrying UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld crashed under circumstances so suspicious that investigators are still uncovering evidence of foul play 60 years later. On September 18, 1961, a DC-6 aircraft designated as the Albertina plummeted from the night sky near Ndola, northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. Aboard was Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary-General of the United Nations, traveling to negotiate a ceasefire in the mineral-rich Katanga province of Congo. The crash killed him and 15 others instantly. Hammarskjöld wasn't just any diplomat. The soft-spoken Swede had transformed the role of Secretary-General from administrative figurehead to active peacemaker. His independent approach made him powerful enemies, particularly among Western powers with economic interests in Africa. He firmly believed in the sovereignty of newly independent African nations and opposed the corporate exploitation of their natural resources. The Congo crisis had erupted following Belgian Congo's independence in 1960, when Katanga province, under Moise Tshombe, declared its own independence. This wasn't merely a local rebellion. Katanga held some of the world's richest uranium and copper deposits, controlled by Belgian mining giant Union Minere. Western powers feared Soviet influence in the region would threaten their access to these critical Cold War resources. The official inquiry settled on a comfortable explanation: pilot error. But the evidence never added up. Local villagers reported seeing a second aircraft and flashes of light in the sky before the crash. The sole survivor, Harold Julian, spoke of explosions before the plane went down, though investigators dismissed his testimony because he was heavily sedated. He died days later from his injuries. When Hammarskjöld's body was recovered, investigators found a playing card, the Ace of Spades, traditionally a death card, tucked into his collar. Photographs showed he had survived the initial impact with minimal visible injuries, raising questions about how he actually died. In 2019, a UN investigation led by Tanzanian judge Mohamed Chande Othman uncovered significant new evidence suggesting foul play. American and British intelligence agencies had been monitoring Hammarskjöld's communications. More disturbingly, the investigation found that an American military plane, a USAF C-124, had been parked on the Ndola airfield that night, unauthorized and never accounted for in official reports. Former intelligence officers have since come forward with claims that mercenary pilot Jan van Riesegem, who had ties to British, Belgian, and U.S. intelligence agencies, may have shot down Hammarskjöld's plane. Charles Southall, a former NSA officer stationed in Cyprus, claimed he heard an intercepted radio communication from a pilot saying, quote, "I see a transport plane. All the lights are on. I'm going to make a run on it." Many files that could resolve these questions remain classified. The US, UK, and South Africa have all refused full access to their intelligence archives, citing national security concerns that somehow persist 6 decades later. As the Cold War's physical battlegrounds eventually gave way to something far more insidious, a new era of conflict emerged through invisible lines of code capable of crossing borders undetected. In 2010, cybersecurity experts discovered what many now consider the first true act of digital warfare, a mysterious computer worm that had been silently sabotaging Iran's nuclear program while displaying normal operations on monitoring screens. This digital weapon, codenamed Stuxnet, represented a watershed moment in modern warfare. Unlike traditional weapons, this malicious software targeted a specific industrial control system manufactured by Siemens that was being used to operate Iran's uranium enrichment centrifuges at the Natanz facility. With unprecedented sophistication, the worm contained over 15,000 lines of code and exploited 4 previously unknown vulnerabilities in Windows operating systems, an unprecedented number of zero-day exploits in a single attack. What made Stuxnet particularly revolutionary was its physical impact. Once inside Iran's systems, the worm targeted programmable logic controllers, or PLCs, that regulated the rotational speed of the delicate centrifuges. Over several months, Stuxnet periodically commanded the centrifuges to spin at dangerously high speeds while simultaneously reporting normal operations to monitoring systems. This caused the uranium enrichment machinery to tear itself apart, while Iranian engineers remained completely unaware of the sabotage taking place right before their eyes. The delivery method proved equally ingenious. Since the Natanz facility operated on an air-gapped network disconnected from the internet, Stuxnet was designed to spread via USB flash drives. Intelligence agents likely recruited unwitting contractors or employees with access to the facility to carry infected drives into the secure location. Once a single computer was infected, the worm could spread across the internal network until reaching its target. The damage was devastating. Reports indicated that between 2009 and 2010, approximately 1,000 IR-1 centrifuges at Natanz were destroyed. Iranian officials initially believed they were experiencing technical failures or sabotaged equipment from foreign suppliers. By the time Iran realized what was happening, their nuclear program had been set back by an estimated 18 months to 2 years. While neither country has officially acknowledged responsibility, forensic evidence and subsequent reporting strongly implicated a joint operation between United States' National Security Agency and Israel's Unit 8200, their elite cyber intelligence division. The operation, reportedly codenamed Olympic Games, began under President George W. Bush and was accelerated under the Obama administration as an alternative to conventional military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. When Stuxnet eventually spread beyond its intended target in 2010, cybersecurity researchers at Belarus-based Kaspersky Lab and other firms began analyzing the code. They discovered a weapon of unprecedented complexity that contained references to biblical figures and subtle clues about its origins, including the string Myrtus, potentially referencing the Hebrew word for Esther, a biblical figure who prevented a Persian plot to destroy the Jews. The implications extended far beyond Iran. Stuxnet's code became a digital blueprint for future attacks, demonstrating that cyber weapons could bridge the gap between digital and physical space. Nations worldwide accelerated their cyber warfare programs, leading to an invisible arms race of digital weaponry. Subsequent attacks like Black Energy against Ukraine's power grid in 2015 and NotPetya in 2017 demonstrated the growing sophistication of state-sponsored cyber operations. Before nation-states weaponized code, they weaponized something far more addictive: heroin. The invisible networks that moved narcotics from Turkish poppy fields to American streets weren't just criminal enterprises. They were geopolitical battlegrounds where intelligence agencies made dangerous alliances that would shape organized crime for generations. In the shadowy port city of Marseille during the early 1950s, a perfect storm was brewing. French labor unions, many with communist ties, threatened to paralyze the nation's economy through massive strikes. As Soviet influence spread across Europe, American intelligence officials grew increasingly desperate to counter communist movements by any means necessary. Their solution? Forge an alliance with the very criminals they were supposed to fight. Marseille's Corsican gangs, known for their ruthless efficiency and fierce anti-communist stance, became unlikely Cold War assets. These crime syndicates, led by notorious figures like Antoine Guerini and Paul Carbone, received covert support from the CIA, who viewed them as valuable foot soldiers against the communist threat. In exchange for disrupting leftist labor movements and infiltrating unions, these criminal organizations received protection for their most profitable venture: heroin production. The operation's scale was staggering. Turkish farmers cultivated vast poppy fields, selling their raw opium to traffickers, who transported it to secret laboratories in Marseille. There, chemists known as coups transformed the opium into high-grade heroin in clandestine laboratories hidden throughout the city. The final product, the purest heroin ever seen, was nicknamed French White for its distinctive color and potency. What made this operation truly remarkable was its efficiency. By the mid-1960s, Marseille's laboratories were producing nearly 80% of America's heroin supply. The drug traveled across the Atlantic through an intricate network of couriers, often concealed in furniture, hollowed-out books, or even diplomatic pouches immune from customs inspection. Once in America, distribution networks controlled by the Five Families of New York transformed smuggled heroin worth millions into street sales worth billions. The impact on American society was devastating. Between 1950 and 1970, heroin addiction rates skyrocketed, particularly in urban centers. New York City alone had an estimated 100,000 heroin users by 1970, with addiction rates disproportionately affecting minority communities. Yet despite mounting evidence of a connection between CIA-protected Corsican criminals and the flood of heroin into America, investigations were consistently hampered by national security concerns. The arrangement's political utility was undeniable. While Americans suffered from addiction, the Corsican syndicate successfully countered communist influence in France's crucial Mediterranean port. Marseille's strategic importance as a NATO logistics hub was preserved, and French labor unions were effectively neutralized through intimidation, violence, and infiltration by criminal elements. The facade finally crumbled in 1971 when American authorities launched a massive crackdown. The joint DEA-French police operation resulted in the famous French Connection bus, including the seizure of 112 pounds of heroin valued at $22 million hidden in a car shipped from France. The subsequent dismantling of major trafficking networks temporarily disrupted the heroin supply chain, but the damage was already done. That template of clandestine operations would find its most destructive expression not in drug networks, but in the skies over a tiny Southeast Asian nation that had declared itself neutral. In Laos, the contradiction was stark. Internationally recognized neutrality on paper, apocalyptic bombardment in reality, creating a secret war that remains largely invisible in American history books even today. While heroin networks funded covert operations in Europe, halfway across the world, the CIA was conducting what would become the most intense bombing campaign in human history. Yet most Americans never even knew it was happening. For 9 straight years, American planes dropped bombs on Laos every 8 minutes, day and night, without congressional authorization or public acknowledgement. The official narrative maintained that American military operations were confined to Vietnam and Cambodia. In reality, by 1964, CIA operatives had established a secret army of 40,000 Hmong tribespeople in the mountains of northern Laos. Under the leadership of General Vang Pao, these indigenous fighters became America's primary ground force against North Vietnamese troops moving supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that snaked through eastern Laos and South Vietnam. From bases in Thailand and aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, American F-4 Phantoms and B-52 Stratofortresses flew thousands of sorties over Laos, carpeting the countryside with cluster bombs. The scale defied comprehension. Over 580,000 bombing missions delivered 2.5 million tons of ordnance into Laotian territory. This exceeded the total bombs dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Yet, this war had never been declared. The CIA maintained a shadow air force through its proprietary airline, Air America. Flying unmarked aircraft, Air America pilots transported troops, refugees, weapons, and supplies throughout the conflict zone. Their unofficial motto, anything, anywhere, anytime, professionally, reflected their central role in sustaining this undeclared war. These pilots even evacuated wounded Hmong fighters and rescued downed American aircrews, often under heavy enemy fire. The human cost proved catastrophic. Entire villages disappeared overnight as bombing transformed the lush Laotian landscape into a moonscape of craters. An estimated 350,000 civilians were killed or wounded, while another 750,000 became internal refugees, roughly a third of Laos's population. The Hmong people paid an especially devastating price, losing nearly a quarter of their adult male population fighting America's secret war. What made this conflict particularly insidious was its deliberate concealment from the American public and Congress. When journalists or lawmakers inquired about operations in Laos, officials consistently denied any military involvement. U.S. Ambassador to Laos William Sullivan orchestrated the bombing campaign from his embassy in Vientiane, earning him the nickname Field Marshal Sullivan among CIA officers. When American forces finally withdrew from Southeast Asia in 1973, the Hmong were abandoned to face the consequences alone. By 1975, the communist Pathet Lao had seized control of the country and launched systematic reprisals against those who had fought alongside Americans. Thousands of Hmong fled to refugee camps in Thailand, while others faced imprisonment, execution, or forced re-education. The most enduring legacy of America's secret war continues to kill Laotians today. Approximately 30% of the bombs dropped on Laos failed to detonate on impact. These unexploded ordnance, or UXO, devices, nicknamed sleeping tigers by locals, have killed or maimed over 20,000 people since the bombing stopped. Children born decades after the war regularly discover and accidentally trigger these deadly remnants while farming or playing. From shadowy spy networks to modern cyber warfare, secret wars have shaped history far more than we're told. But secrecy comes at a cost. While these stories are based on historical research, many details remain classified, disputed, or lost to time. Take this information with reservation, question narratives, and always dig deeper. Want to uncover more hidden truths? Subscribe now and never miss an episode.